Well, welcome to this evening's open news meeting on the 7th day of the conflict in Ukraine. I'm Matt Dancona, I'm editor at Tortoise, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for this, which is our weekly thinking, at which we try to generate ideas and harvest tips that are true to our slow media mission and get our bearings really and try and think where we should be navigating the great ship of Tortoise Media. And this is especially important because right now, because clearly there is only one story, I was going to say in town, but really in planet. And the question for us as a newsroom is how we cover this story in a distinctive fashion that's not limited by the minute by minute rolling news and social media agenda, which really in the digital age, as I'm sure you've discovered as I have, can give new meaning to the words fog of war. So I really hope that you'll chip in with your thoughts and ideas and observations and recommendations as to where we should be now at the beginning of the conflict, directing our attention with the view to later reports. And my brilliant colleague Nimo will be hosting the chat this evening. So please ping in thoughts to Nimo. Hi, Nimo. Do, if you haven't already, sign up to our SenseMaker email, which I would say this, wouldn't I? But I genuinely have found I've just come back from a bit of leave and I found it's an extraordinary kind of navigating tool through this very, very multi-layered crisis. And also listen to our series of voicemails, Invaded, which you can get on any podcast platform, which are a carefully curated selection of very personal, very fascinating and moving testimonies from the ground in the crisis. I suppose the risk when you're trying to get a handle on a story of this scale, which deserves from the off and unambiguously the label of historic, is that you try and get a sense of everything and you risk ending up with a sense of nothing. So we can't do everything, but let's not do nothing. And with that in mind, I'd really like to try and, as far as possible, focus the conversation this evening to narrow the lens a little and to look, I guess, at the, if you like, the operational and military aspect of what's going on, both in terms of conventional weaponry, cyber warfare, the role of social media and so on, to get a sense of not just a sort of boy's own sense of the kit that's around, but also a sense of what is actually going on the ground and what kinds of techniques are being deployed in this crisis. And I think the word yet will crop up more than once because it's clear that not everything that is going to be deployed has yet been deployed. So I'd like to dive straight in and turn to our World Affairs editor, Giles Patel, to whom I always turn when I don't know the answer to something in this and other matters. Giles, hi, how are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good. Giles, we've been watching, I guess, what looks like a pincer movement militarily, from Crimea in the south and Belarus in the north. And in particular, in the last few days, this extraordinary image of a 40-mile convoy heading towards Kiev. I heard on Mark Urban, Newsnight's defense editor, say that he thought it amounted to about a brigade, about 5,000 people. That was a pure guesstimate, but anyway, that was his guesstimate. What's, from what you're hearing, what you're reading, what's in the convoy and why is it slowing?
God, I wish I knew. Sometimes, Matt, all I can do is help in a process of asking the right questions. Look, what we think we know, and there was quite a lot of informed speculation about this from Pentagon sources quoted overnight, is that it includes tanks and armor, but also an awful lot of trucks, lorries, supplies, logistics. The strategy apparently is dates from Soviet times. It's it's bring your wagons with you so that you don't run out. The risk is that if you get stuck, everything gets stuck. Why is it stuck? I wish I knew. We've been hearing for 48 hours now that its progress has slowed to a crawl. And I did put out a request for some more informed speculation earlier today. I haven't heard back. My question is really, has it ground to a halt? Luke is saying in the chat, fuel, and there is, and Max, who is staying very plugged in, lack of food too. All these things are possible. The question already arises, have they been slowed as opposed to slowing of their own accord? And if not, are the Ukrainian defense forces and civil militias, whose resistance we know from elsewhere has been nothing less than heroic, preparing a welcome for them when they do finally reach the outskirts of Kiev? And I think a key question there is what role, if any, will airborne forces play? Why do I ask that? Because the Russian Air Force has so far been surprisingly not in evidence. They have not achieved air supremacy. The much smaller Ukrainian Air Force remains largely flyable. What we don't know is whether the Turkish drones, which are not just reconnaissance drones, they have attack capabilities, are still active. How many may be left? Whether there may be more on the way. If I may, just in 2 minutes, Matt, sketch out just very quickly what I think we can say with confidence about the situation generally, and what some questions are that we should be asking, because I think, unless you'd like to move on.
No, that's exactly what I'd love to hear.
Because you made the point about the fog of war, and I think I think more accurately we're facing a blizzard, because of course even more than in 2014 or Kuwait, or we are lucky enough in a sense to be getting a massive stream of information from an army of smartphone owners, and the challenge is to sort the dependable and the significant from the fake and the insignificant. But I think there are just a few broad things that we can say about the Russian advance, about Ukrainian resistance, about the rest of the world's response, about the information war, and about the humanitarian crisis. And very, very briefly, the advance has been slow. I think it's clear it's not. We're not just drinking the Kool-Aid here. It is much slower. It has gone much slower than intended for the Russians. Probably will get worse. The use of unguided munitions in Kharkiv recalls Grozny is harrowing to watch and must be terrifying to experience. They've taken no major cities yet, however. I've mentioned the situation as regards air supremacy. Estimates of Russian casualties now range from 500. The Russian Ministry of Defense has recently, just in the past few hours, released its first figures, which are around 500 to 5,000, which is what the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is claiming at the moment. They're in the hundreds, I think we can say, military and civilian combined for Ukraine, but rising tragically fast. I've mentioned the Ukrainian resistance. I'll leave it at heroic, both seen and unseen for now. The rest of the world's response. We were on a call earlier today with UK national security people. There is a 12-pronged sanctions response, but I think that's just the UK, that never mind EU and US. I think that what I've been hearing is the most significant component and the newest in terms of scarcely with precedent is the freezing of central bank reserves. Now, we know that Putin's finance minister has accumulated around 630 billion in a war chest for this war, of which I am told about 3/4 maybe in foreign freezable assets and now frozen, with about 20% possibly in gold, literally in gold, in Russia, and other assets held by China. But I think that is the single most significant piece of the sanctions piece. I may be wrong, and I'd be really interested to hear what people say. On the information war, no evidence of a change of any of the state-controlled TV in Russia veering off message, but as Max and others at Tortoise have been monitoring, some really, of course, no internet firewall either. So true stories from the front, as it were, possibly beginning to get through, including one in the form of a voicemail. Max could perhaps tell us more about that has been widely distributed by the Kiev Independent, but it appears to be from a bereaved family in the Altai, which is in the middle of Siberia, to which, if this report is true, news has arrived that a detachment from there was almost entirely wiped out last week in Ukraine. And of course, there's the question, well, we're talking about information, of the extent to which Zelensky's own appeals in Russian have reached his people. We talked a bit about that in last night's thinking. And on the humanitarian side, that's the subject of our Sensemaker today. We reckon that if you include refugees who've reached the border and internally displaced Ukrainians, the number is already approaching 1 million. And of course, we've read that UN and other estimates are that number will vastly exceed that to 4 and perhaps 7 million, a very large share of the national population. So why is the column stalled? That's where we started. I'm sorry, Matt, but
that in a way
I couldn't answer it.
I want characteristically to lower the tone if I can a bit, and just look a little bit at what we think the Russians actually have, because at the start of the conflict, there was a lot of listing of, they've got a very impressive arsenal of Iskander-M short-range ballistic missiles, as you said, the M21 Grads, some sightings of Su-34 bombers, talk today of paratroopers landing in Kharkiv, and a lot of heavy artillery. And yet those sort of early inventories, this was a very serious, albeit mostly entirely conventional war machine heading towards the Ukrainian capital, either isn't, or is being held back, or is much more patchily maintained than we had been led to believe. And I just wonder what your impression, I mean, so as someone who's covered Russian affairs for so many years with such distinction, what your kind of sense of what the state of Russian military hardware is?
Well, I'll be honest, the only concrete comparison that I can draw is with the Second Chechen War, which was a little more efficient in terms of military organization than the first, but it involved a very slow build-up and then a remorseless First World War style creeping barrage of Grozny that destroyed the whole city over the course of about 3 months, so that it was completely leveled. And let us not forget that remains an entirely unfortunate, I mean, ask me a week ago, I'd have said it was implausible, and I did in meetings. But now, if you look at the assembled hardware, even though it's not in position, but if you look at the bombardment of Kharkiv as a symbol of intent, you have to assume that it is on Putin's list of options to level Kharkiv as he leveled Grozny. And there is absolutely nothing subtle about the way it's done. Almost, I think I could say, all of the weapons are not smart, are unguided, old-fashioned artillery, and these multiple missile launch systems. In the intervening 20 years, the Russian military is supposed to have modernized itself extensively. And of course, Russian military spending as a proportion of GDP is very high. Let's remember that the GDP itself remains quite low. So it's entirely possible, given that the whole system is corrupt and as corrupt as ever, that underneath the glitzy exterior, not unlike that which Soviet military march past used to show us in Red Square, it remains a much more dysfunctional military machine than we were led to believe. That's entirely possible. And frankly, this is the first real test. And this is what we're finding out. But we have to be careful. Believable, almost comical, if it weren't tragic, military incompetence on the part of the Russian army, just like any army, to be honest. But we must be aware of wishful thinking at this point.
And just finally, Giles, I mean, that's hugely enlightening. In terms of the Ukrainian capability, naturally and quite properly, there's been a huge amount of admiration and awe for, if you like, the citizen militia mentality of the Ukrainian people in the last week, and not only the sort of instantly iconic status of Zelensky, but also the extraordinary there's extraordinary videos, clips we've seen of my own favorite of someone carrying a mine with a fag in his mouth, just amazing sang-froid. But it's possible, I think, to over-romanticize that, because when you have a war machine heading towards you, pluck alone is not enough. So the question is that in the last 20 or 30 years, quite a lot of kit has headed from the West to Ukraine. And I wonder, all sorts of things, ranging from Stingers to TB2 drones made in Turkey and a whole variety of other things. But really, when you boil it down, how significant is the Ukrainian military infrastructure?
Well, I'd just say two things. They've had 8 years of increased military spending off the springboard, as it were, of the Crimean invasion / reality check, including substantial American aid every year, despite Trump's efforts to slow it down. And in the Donbass, they have had a military training operation, as it were, which has given a core of Ukraine's land forces combat experience that apparently a lot of the Russian troops committed in the first phase of this war don't have. I'll defer to other people on the call on the military hardware, except to say that clearly the gratitude for the Javelin anti-tank weapons sent by the UK and the pleas from Zelensky and every Ukrainian MP who gets on the air for more military hardware means that it is still in desperately short supply. And of course, there's a logistical challenge coming up, which is getting it in, given that there is no no-fly zone, and given that even though the Russian Air Force has not been as in evidence as we expected, many runways are now potholed. So, we know that the US is sending $350 million worth of extra kit, perhaps more, that Germany has made a historic change. It will send arms of its own, and it will allow the Baltics to send German-made arms to this conflict zone. But there is a big challenge now that it's been left this late in getting it in.
Thank you very much, Giles. It's hugely helpful. I'm sure we'll be back to you later in the thinking. Can I turn now to our guest, Dmitri Alperovitch, who's been a guest of Tortoise before, chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, but also, I suppose, best known in this context as co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike, which is a group that specializes in cyber attack response services and threat intelligence. Thank you, Dmitri, for joining us. I know how busy you are. You're in DC and doubtless working around the clock. Before we move on to the question of cyber warfare, I know you have some thoughts on the convoy.
Yeah, well, in general, I think that it's a mistake to assume that the Russians are bogged down, because they're actually making quite a bit of progress in the north, quite a bit of progress in the south. And their rate of advance is actually very good in some of those places. Just to give you context, if you look at the US invasion of Iraq, the dash to Baghdad was about 550 kilometers. It took the US 2 weeks to get there. If you look at what the Russians have done in the first 5 days of the conflict from Crimea, they surrounded Mariupol. That's about 400 kilometers in 5 days, a much faster rate of advance than the US. They also went towards Mykolaiv in the west. That's about another 300 kilometers. Towards Zaporozhye, another 250 or so kilometers. From the north, from the Sumy area, they're now approaching Kiev. They're about to surround Chernihiv, which is also another 150 or so kilometers. I'm sorry, 300 kilometers or so. So they actually have made quite a few advances. Obviously, a lot of things have not worked well for them, and their first 4 days of the conflict has been amazingly dumb, I would say, in terms of expecting the Ukrainian forces to just fold and disappear, and not using the full elements of their artillery, long-range fires, bombing, tactical aviation, etc. They're starting to get that more engaged, and we're now seeing obviously a huge increase in civilian casualties because their bombs are falling off target. They bombed. They tried to bomb an SBU, Ukrainian intelligence building in Kharkiv last night, and hit a university across the street. So we're going to be seeing a lot more of this type of activity in main cities going forward. But on the ground, I think it's a mistake to assume that they have not made progress. They've taken Kherson, which is a pretty significant city. They're in Mykolaiv in the south. They're in Mariupol in the south. And they're going to surround Kiev probably in the next few days. So the Ukrainians are not in a good position here, despite the losses that they've been able to inflict on the Russians, despite all the logistical issues that the Russians have had, and the plan that was quite mind-blowingly stupid, I would say.
So, okay, so we need to caveat the assumption that it is all terribly disappointing for the Russians in terms of their progress, and look perhaps at as we should at a longer time frame. On the question of cyber warfare, it's fascinating to me as someone who's sort of by no means an expert on Russian strategy, but also the word Russian and cyber warfare appear almost sort of joined at the hip in almost all journalism now. And the assumption always is that if there's any form of conflict or any form of intervention in electoral processes, it is always under the umbrella of cyber warfare. So when this conflict began to hove into view, there were a flurry of articles and podcasts and broadcast programs about how this was basically going to be the first cyber warfare war. Now, we're only on day 7, but that does not seem to have been the case. Can you enlighten us as to whether that is simply because cyber warfare attacks on key infrastructure in Ukraine simply haven't happened yet, or that they're unlikely to happen at all?
I don't think it's likely to happen at all. I never believed that cyber would play a significant part in this campaign. The reality is that if you have the dominance and fires in tactical aviation that the Russians have, they don't need to use cyber. If they want to take down the grid in Ukraine, they can just bomb the substations very easily. They can send missile strikes against them and ensure that they go down and ensure that power is out in Kiev. Much more difficult to do so in cyberspace, not impossible, of course, and they've done it on a few occasions. But the problem with cyber attacks is that they don't have the permanent damage that you can inflict through kinetic action. You can take down power for a few hours, but the Ukrainians will inevitably bring it back up. And they're quite adept at doing so and quite resilient against cyber attacks, given that they've been pummeled by them over the last 8 years. So cyber is a perfect tool for the gray zone warfare, where you're not quite in a state of war and not quite in peacetime, where you can inflict damage with somewhat deniable capabilities. but probably not permanent damage. When you're in actual warfare, it becomes much less needed and much less useful, to be honest with you. I did think that they would use at least some tactical operations at the start of the conflict to try to impede mobilization, like targeting, for example, the mobilization databases that the Ukrainians keep of their reservists and volunteers, that they would try to target communications. They haven't done any of that, and it's been quite surprising. They haven't done that kinetically either, though, and have not even engaged their very impressive electronic warfare capabilities. They brought a number of major vehicles to the Ukrainian border over last year that can basically shut off communications across much of the country. They haven't done that, I think, in part because they're in a completely amazing fashion actually using cell phones and consumer radios for communications themselves, completely unsecure. The Ukrainians are tapping it, along with probably many other intel agencies. The fact that they've not really used any secure military communications that they do have is just absolutely mind-boggling. But yeah, cyber has not played a big role in this, and I don't expect it to going forward.
President Biden has issued very few specific threats of a military or quasi-military form during this crisis. However, one thing he did say was that if cyber warfare from Russia was in any way aimed at the West and the US in particular, there would be a cataclysmic response. Do you think that was just a sort of general observation, or is there a genuine prospect that part of the collateral of this might be, you talked about psychological destabilization, that there might be cyber attacks from Russia upon countries other than Ukraine?
Yeah, there is not just concern, but almost an expectation in U.S. government right now that there will be cyber retaliation from Russia for the very severe, very harsh sanctions that both U.S. and Europe and many other countries have joined in on, trying to choke off the Russian economy. No one expects Russia to take that line down. Cyber is one of the ways in which they can respond. We haven't seen that response yet, but I think it's highly likely in the offing here. It's understandable that the Russians are a little bit busy right now prosecuting this terrible war in Ukraine, but at some point they're going to redirect their attention to the West and try to figure out how to apply pressure on US and Europe to try to come out from underneath these this horrible sanctions that they're under. And you know, that was the intent of Biden's warning, that we will not we will respond to these cyber attacks should they occur. We will see what we can do, engaging in a cyber tit for tat with Russia, trying to see who can damage more of each other's critical infrastructure is in no one's interest and is highly escalatory, can easily translate into kinetic conflict if we're not careful. So it'll be very, very challenging to try to manage this escalation going forward.
Nima makes a very good point in the chat, actually, Dmitri, which I think is, on a sort of 101 basis, is really worth nailing down, which is the phrase cyber warfare has become very loosely applied to almost anything from Facebook posts to attacks on national grids. Can you give us a professional's definition of what it is, what it really means, what its granular implications are, and what sorts of defensive mechanisms can be mounted against it?
Yeah, well, no country actually defines cyber warfare. They define a range of cyber offensive operations. So you can do a variety of operations where you go inside foreign networks, civilian networks, corporate networks, or military and government networks. And you can do a variety of things in those networks. One, you can obviously steal data. That's called espionage. And pretty much every country, advanced country on the planet is doing it. Secondly, you can try to destroy data or destroy systems, destroy networks, and that's called cyber network attack operations, as opposed to just espionage, exploitation type of operations. And of course, you can do that against a variety of different targets. The Russians have been doing it both through criminal groups that they've been, at a minimum, turning a blind eye to, that have been ransoming networks like the Colonial Pipeline here in the United States back in May of last year, and many, many others, including hospitals and small businesses, police departments, etc. And they've been also doing that on a more targeted scale from their intelligence agencies. They've unleashed the most destructive attack in history called NotPetya, which was an attack against Ukraine in 2017, but spread much broader than just Ukraine and targeted numerous multinationals like Maersk and Merck and FedEx and many others. And they've done operations like targeting the Olympics in South Korea in 2018 to retaliate for the banning of Russian athletes there. But in terms of sort of strategic military intent with cyber operations, that's where you're going to try to see how you can combine specific disruption with certain kinetic objectives. So there's been reports that the Israelis, for example, have used cyber operations to temporarily blind Syrian air defense systems when they were flying in to bomb the Syrian nuclear reactor about a decade ago. That's sort of how you should be thinking about cyber operations, is that they can achieve a very tactical objective and a temporary one that can facilitate other kinetic action that you may be planning.
That's brilliant, Dmitri, and we'll come back to you, I'm sure. Just before we move on, I'd like to go to my colleague Max Rieback, who's been following this very carefully on a number of fronts and sort of providing a rolling and invaluable service of just monitoring just about everything in the world on this. So it would be idle of me not to turn to you, Max, as a sort of font of wisdom. What's your take today on, bearing in mind the way we're trying to frame this open news meeting, what's your take on where we are on the various forms of belligerence that are being mounted outside of the sanctions regime, so to speak?
Sorry, just if you could repeat the last part of your question there, Matt. I think.
Well, I mean, we as it were, we know there is a sanctions regime. We know all about SWIFT. We know all about the refugee crisis. What I'm trying to get at in this strand is what's the state of play on the various kind of confrontational fronts, the direct confrontational fronts, be it conventional weaponry on the ground, the convoy, and as Dmitri was talking about, cyber. I mean, what are you picking up from your many contacts?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd firstly say that I'm spending most of my day at the moment just going through different Telegram channels and Twitter channels to try and have a look at things, as well as talking to kind of former colleagues and contacts. So I think, I'd be adding to a lot of what Giles has been saying, as well as Dmitri. I've just been looking again on Reuters in particular recently and seeing that the Turkish military is giving more, or the Turks are giving more drones over, which have been quite effective in taking out different aspects of Russian troops and movements that way, but also seeing a number of stories of Chechen forces which have been neutralized, particularly those that were sent in to assassinate Zelensky. So it's hard for me to really comment on what I'm seeing in terms of military hardware being moved over. I think there's been a great couple of sense makers recently about the change in Germany's policy and how that's seen certain pieces of hardware being given to Ukraine in a way that would not have happened in the past, that I suggest people check out. But a lot of what I've seen has been many more stories about Ukrainian successes against Russian forces or Chechen forces or the Belarusians, which have been, Lukashenko has claimed that they've not gone in, but they've seen reports from the Ukrainian government as well as journalists saying that they have done, but seeing many more of the kind of stories about how vehicles are breaking down, Ukrainians are kind of taking those over and kind of stockpiling a lot of Russian hardware. It's hard to say whether that's been verified. I haven't seen reports that has been. A lot of that's coming from Twitter and Telegram. I think the other thing that's interesting that I've kind of been seeing a lot of recently is just, which again is not confirmed, it's hard to see, but it does keep coming up of Russian soldiers surrendering or leaving their hardware on the side of the road and running away. that isn't, I highly caveat, is in a bubble, probably. Hearing Dmitri talk about things is putting a sense of perspective in place. But does that become more frequently, and also seeing the Ukrainians making sure that they are, when they have the phone numbers of Russian soldiers' parents, they've been phoning them up and having the soldiers call home and explain what's going on, which has been, as Giles mentioned, possibly an effective way of communicating inside Russia what's been going on. Sorry, that was kind of jumping around on a number of different points.
No, it's really useful. I mean, what I suppose is fascinating to me, and may not be, there may not be a kind of definitive answer to it yet, is I was watching Newsnight the other night, and there was a very eloquent and impressive Ukrainian MP talking to, I think, Mark Urban, or was it Lewis Goodall, one or the other. And she just put her children to bed, and she was talking about what it was like in Kiev. And then she, in the middle of her very articulate explanation of where things were and how things seemed to her, she picked up a AK-47 and brandished it at the camera and said, "This is what I got this morning." So on the one hand, you have a untrained citizen militia, which has inspired the world and caused standing ovations in forums all over the planet. But the question really is, does that amount to a viable defense force when faced with the war machine that, for all its flaws and setbacks, is undoubtedly heading into Ukraine? In other words, how well organized and how well armed is the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian armed services, and how are we being distracted by this rather romantic Spartan image of citizen soldiers taking to the streets?
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think it really depends, sadly, what victory potentially looks like in terms of the response to your question. I think if you're talking about Ukrainian forces pushing Russian troops out of Ukraine in the next 6 months, off of the hardware that they currently have and the personnel that they have, from what Dmitri's saying, from what I've seen, that doesn't seem likely, and therefore that type of victory possibly not. What is a really painful thing to be grappling with and coming to terms with is the idea that this will be a very long and protracted conflict. I think, as we've seen in other conflict zones around the world, you can have the strongest military, but actually when you come up against a well-armed, well-organized insurgency, that can be very, very difficult to repress. And maybe it's a very crude comparison, but when you look at how well-armed the Taliban were versus what you're looking at in terms of the Ukrainian military and civil society, I mean, this is worlds apart, I would say. Significantly better armed, and also getting a lot more hardware straight to them from their borders. So I find it hard to imagine a world in which, in the long run, Russia wins this, because I think the will from the military and civil society within Ukraine is huge, and the will from the West to keep funding that with hardware is pretty significant. But
it's very interesting to me because a writer I have great time for and follow a lot is David Kilcullen, and he brought out a book last year, I think it was, called The Dragons and the Snakes, which argued that we were moving from an era run by military dragons to one run by snakes. In other words, one where asymmetric warfare was the norm. And as you say, Max, that actually it's very hard for a traditional army to beat a well-armed insurgency with decent morale. Again, though, the caveat is, that if the dragon is big enough, no matter how clever and cunning the snake is, it can end up with a squash snake. So I find myself, very drawn by the new images of new warfare and new and different types of warfare. But also, when I see a bloody big 40-mile convoy heading towards Kiev, I think, well, that focuses the mind somewhat. Max is gone.
No, sorry, I'm there. I struggled to get myself off mute for some reason. I completely hear that. I think at this stage, it's for me where I'm coming from is trying to grapple with a point of hope and something to focus on, which I appreciate is not the purpose of necessarily a thinking, but
well, I think it is, to the extent that what one's trying to work out is whether there's been a surge of optimism, if you like, after an initial feeling of doom, and the question, one has to interrogate that optimism and see whether it's grounded, and a lot of that, is unfortunately looking for hard data and evidence that is extremely hard to get hold of.
That's what.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say. I think the difficult, I think we're all trying to make predictions when it's just too early, and it's too soon to know. I think we don't. It's hard to. I can't. This time last week, it was the eve of the war, and we didn't know it. And it doesn't feel like that. It feels like this has been going on for a very long time already. So the sense I get is we're all trying to make predictions of where is this going to be, and we're 7 days in, not even 7 days into the conflict yet. If we're looking in very recent history in terms of the strength of Ukrainian civil society during the Maidan conflict, revolution and uprising, which was amazing to see, and then also the role civil society took when Luhansk and Donetsk was invaded, was also, or Russian-backed separatists broke out, was also significant and really important in stopping that move forward or westward. So I think that it's still too early to really comment, but there is a lot to be said about Ukrainian civil society, which has also received significant funding and capacity building over the last 8 years from the US, the UK, the EU. Most significant donors have been strengthening that aspect of Ukrainian society as well, as much as they have done on training and hardware for the military.
And I'd like to, if I may, to bring in a couple of people from the chat. Julie Bush, I don't know if you're still there, if you're around. Julie, hi, how are you?
Hi, how are you? I'm fine.
Good to see you. You made a really good point at the beginning of all this, which is, well, I don't want to paraphrase it, but essentially, are we kidding ourselves? We're actually already in a war. And I just wondered if you might elaborate on that.
Well, some commentators have said such. I mean, Fiona Hill was interviewed for Politico, and she was basically saying that. And journalists like Sarah Kendzior of Gaslit Nation and Andrea Chalupa of Gaslit Nation were saying the same, that in fact, it depends how you define war, but Russia has been interfering, for definite in the 2016 US election, possibly in Brexit. I don't think that's ever really been proved, but that is already, whether you call it, it's still warfare. It's not tanks and guns and bombs and everything else, but that is, Putin has already, for the last 8 years or so, has been involved in warfare against us, against Western governments. We haven't really stood up robustly to. So, and their argument was that the Western governments are already in a world war and they just don't realize it yet.
And do you draw from that the conclusion that actually whatever we say to the contrary, we will get drawn in deeper and deeper forms?
Well, I was going to say at the beginning of this war, and it's only 7 days, which is a ridiculous thing to say.
Yeah, it's extremely early days.
And I was, when they were saying we can't have a no-fly zone because we'll be drawn into, a military war, and I was going, well, I understand that. And now I just think, I don't know. I mean, I just think Russia has such a powerful army. They've only used a small amount of it. That at some point, there's a tipping point where you can't just sit and watch hundreds of thousands of people being slaughtered. The Western governments, just can't sit and watch that and I don't know what that tipping point is. And I know that we are supplying hardware and weapons and, you know, kind of covertly or otherwise. And I just think I don't know where that tipping point is, but I think there is a point where you can't just watch slaughter happening and not do anything.
Yeah, understood. Thank you, Julie. I know Dmitri has to go quite soon, so if I'm going to just grab him one last time and say, Dmitri, you know, you have huge experience in this area. What are your instincts about what we can expect in the next couple of weeks and beyond?
So, as I said, the Russians are going back to their doctrine of using overwhelming force and fires to destroy Ukrainian forces and unfortunately probably destroy Ukrainian cities. So I fully expect that they will unleash a barrage of rockets and other munitions on Kiev in the coming days as they surround it and try to take it. And it'll just be absolutely devastating. Now, the problem that Vladimir Putin faces, though, is that his initial objectives was to change the government, to install a puppet regime government that would take a pro-Russian orientation towards him and implement all the things that he wants: recognition of Crimea as Russian, no joining of NATO and EU, and some sort of demilitarization agreement. I think that's now out of the question. He can certainly topple Zelensky. He might even be able to kill him, but he will not be able to install a regime that would be supported by any significant portion of the Ukrainian population. And you would have to use incredibly large forces to sustain an occupation, which the Russians just don't have the capability to do, nor will they have the resources to do, given the economic sanctions they're now experiencing. So I do wonder at some point whether Putin will decide that he needs to lower his appetite and potentially make a deal with Zelensky and try to get some concessions on NATO, some concessions on weaponry and Crimea as well from Zelensky. Not sure that Zelensky would go for that, but I wouldn't be surprised. There are talks going on right now as we speak in Belarus between the Ukrainian side and the Russian side. I wouldn't be surprised if they're trying to explore some room for compromise here.
Thank you, Dmitri, and I know you have to go, but thank you very much for your time, which is valuable, and we really appreciate it. Can I go to my colleague Luke Damon now, who has been, as he always is, busy with something interesting. It's a sort of, it should be his middle name, really. He's always got something going that is fascinating, and I know you've been doing a lot of work, Luke, on I suppose looking at this war, which if Vietnam was the first rock and roll war, this is probably the first TikTok war. And that's a rather glib way of putting the fact that this is, I guess, the first major conflict that has been conducted in the era of social media. I mean, Syria coincided with Twitter and Facebook, but it had less of a global command on people's imagination. So what are your kind of investigations revealing about social media and the information war?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I should say it's not just me, but Alexei and Patricia and our team as well. I was listening to Dmitri speaking there and thinking about the fact that a lot has certainly been made of Ukraine's ascendancy in the information war, as it were, and there's a lot of ink spilled on, the significance of its social media presence and that of Zelensky himself. It's definitely galvanized the West. It's probably played into the conversation around sanctions and maybe even sped those up. I think it's certainly been a factor in shaping the attitude that big tech companies like Google, TikTok, and most recently and perhaps most significantly Apple have taken. The UN just voted overwhelmingly to condemn or demand the withdrawal of Russian aggressors from Ukraine. But I think I'm left thinking that what we have to unpick is whether any of that matters. And also whether if what we care about is mitigating the tragic loss of life taking place in Ukraine right now, if what we care about is that, then this information war is a strange one to try and get your head around, because I would share the assessment of Dmitri and some of the other people that are speaking in the chat. How significant is a battle on social media if in the next 48 hours Kiev's defenses in other parts of the country are obliterated and swept aside? So that certainly remains to be seen. I would just add that one of the things we're trying to follow is the huge amount of sort of counter information, or I guess truth telling, being done by Ukrainian citizens, some of whom are amateurs and some of whom are technology experts, and then the people who they're now collaborating around the world to try and put out information, everything from where there have been missile strikes to where there is shelter and food available. And we're hopefully going to be able to tell some of that story over the next couple of days, but I'll stop banging on because I can see some of the members, including Sean, have got their hand up.
That's brilliant, Luke. Actually, let's bring in Sean Taylor now and ask him what his view is. Sean, hi. Good to see you. Fire away.
Great to be included and a great conversation. I think the tragedy of this is, as it's playing out on our screens, that we can't underestimate that Putin doesn't actually care about the information that's going through. And I think the thing that disappoints me rather at the moment, and I come at this from both a ex-military angle and an now economic angle, is that where I thought that there might be some change would be amongst his general staff, but clearly not, because they have now changed the law, as you may know, that Russian soldiers can be buried outside of Russia. Therefore, you're not seeing the body bag flights back to various cities as you used to in Afghanistan. So that probably explains why mothers aren't trying to burn down the Kremlin just yet, although I say just yet. The nature of warfare and the fog of this warfare is something that, history, as I wrote in the history is the toolbox of the future. And when the Germans took on the Soviet army in the first Battle of Kiev in 1941, 1942, it took them 458,000 soldiers. Now, the reason I raise that is that should this encirclement start squeezing Kiev, or Kiev, I have to watch my pronunciation these days, showing my age there, is that fighting in urban areas is the dirtiest, most unpleasant situation that you could ever imagine. And the advantage is with the defender. And so what is the Russian tactic to that? We saw it in Aleppo. We saw it early days, once the vanguard of the troops have gone in, and that's a Russian use of this, is that sadly, they do tend to bomb everything into the Stone Age. And I think that's what we're slightly seeing now. And that's what concerns me, and having been a veteran of one of the last major European punch-ups in Kosovo and Bosnia, is that I just don't think he cares what the world's saying, because if he cared, he would have taken the opportunity, excuse me, for the off-ramp. That's what I think. I think it's like all about face now, isn't it? So the world has got to come up with an opportunity to, let him save some, not that we want to, but save some, or he's got to be removed full stop. And I think my heart reaches out to certainly the population there, but once they get inside those streets, I think the Russians are in for a particularly hard time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And it's very interesting you say that, because I was speaking to a minister today who said, with some alarm, that one of the things that's characterizing this conflict is that the quite busy back channels that used to characterize UK, Russian and Washington, Moscow relations during the Cold War are alarmingly quiet. That there isn't, to your point, really, that there isn't a kind of a lower tier, or at least it's a much thinner tier than it used to be, where the real decisions were being taken, and that Putin really is A, uninterested, and B, not troubled by any significant rebellion to date from his general staff. Before I can see time is marching on, I wouldn't want to leave out Andrew Girdwood, if you're there, Andrew.
Yeah.
Hey, Andrew, how's it going?
It's all right.
Good. Tell us your thoughts.
I think I'm more pessimistic. I just don't see the Russians stopping, and therefore I think it's inevitable. I mean, they sat in Afghanistan for 10 years. I think they'll sit in Ukraine for as long as Putin's prepared to be there, which, as discussed, is until he's happy.
By which you mean it doesn't really matter. I mean, all of the variables that we discuss at great length in the Western media are frankly irrelevant.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like I was going to say icing on the cake, but that's like a horrible expression. It's deck chairs on the Titanic. The fact that Russia is a steamroller, the steamroller is rolling into the Ukraine. It will continue to roll this way until Putin is satisfied. The rest is dressing.
The counter argument being that the sanctions, when they finally bite, will create a completely different context to his regime. But of course, it's way too early to make a judgment on that. I see time is running out. Agatha has completed her march. I'm tempted to say that there's not much I can really add to what's been said by people who know much more about it than me, but there are just a few points I'd like to draw out. I mean, I think Giles really nailed it by saying that the Russian advance is not going as well as they may have hoped, but it's not going as badly as we may like. I would, for one, in terms of the direction of our journalism, I'd still like to know more about the actual detail of the weaponry they have, why some of it appears not to be delivering in the way that one would expect, and what the convoy is actually consisted of. Is it primarily armored vehicles? Is it primarily artillery? You know, what exactly is in it, and why is it not moving as fast as we all think? Is that actually, as some have suggested, a tactical move, or is it cock up rather than conspiracy? On cyber, I think Dmitri was fascinating on the fact that it's not in Ukraine at the moment we should be looking for the impact of cyber warfare, but in the West and in Western corporations and nations. And I think that is a very fruitful line of inquiry to pursue, because it makes all the sense in the world. Also, I'm left puzzling over whether or not the Ukrainian army, which I still don't fully understand, is in fact a real army or a citizen militia with some bolt-on extras, and because the answer to that question contains much else, and then that fed in very neatly into what Luke was saying about the nature of the social media war and the extent to which that is now not just, I think, as it were, shaping opinion inside Ukraine and indeed Russia, but also outside it. Some very ugly, I noticed Max putting out in the chat, some very ugly denazification memes are doing the rounds, and they are all based in complete fake news. They are there, and they are doing their work, and this will become a bigger problem, I suspect, as the war continues. And finally, to return to what Dmitri said, that it is, it appears to me that the kind of war that Putin wanted to fight is not the war he's getting, at minimum. And therefore, the interesting question is, does Putin have it in him, and does he have the backing of the Russian people 6 months from now to pursue something that looks more like Vietnam than shock and awe? And I think that's the unknowable question. I think there's, as I said, there's a lot more granular work to be done. on what the different elements in this, both cyber and conventional and indeed non-conventional weaponry are, and who has what. And this is some of the most difficult data to get hold of, but it is as important as the very, very important testimonies of the individuals who are on the ground and reporting, you know, the suffering that they're going through, both as combatants and refugees. So I think we have many things to take away from tonight and pursue. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone. As ever, there's so much more we could say and pursue. We will surely be returning to this very often. Do come to the rest of Think-Ins this week. Sign up to SenseMaker and listen to the wonderful Invaded series. Thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you.